Welcome to Presidential Policies. This is the second episode. In the first episode, we talked about Reagan, and we're going to continue talking about Reagan this week. Reagan was one of the most successful politicians in U.S. history, and of the 17 presidents in the last 100 years, he had the sixth highest rate of economic growth during his term. Reagan made several tax changes which can help us understand how to restore long-term prosperity. Reagan had a big tax cut in his first year in office that took the top tax rate down from 70% in 1980 to 50% in 1982. And this tax cut reduced the unproductive tax avoidance, and stronger growth followed that tax cut. His other big tax change was the 1986 tax reform, which took the top rate down from 50% in 1986 in two steps to 28% in 1988. And this tax cut reduced productive tax avoidance, and economic growth weakened after the 1986 tax reform. Now, unproductive tax avoidance is where capitalists or people with great assets or great talent look at the after-tax reward of fully utilizing their capital and talent and find it uninspiring, that it's not worth giving it their full best effort. So a prerequisite for strong economic growth is to minimize unproductive tax avoidance. And you can accomplish that with when the first 5 to 10 brackets in an income tax schedule allow business owners to take a large enough share of business revenue, a large enough amount of business revenue as personal income at a low enough average tax rate that it is worthwhile for those with capital and talent to utilize their resources. But it doesn't guarantee stronger growth. The long-term economic growth rate is highly sensitive to the ratio of business revenue used to run and grow businesses. Business owners choose what portion of revenue goes into the deductible expenditures of equipment, marketing, research, training, and other expenditures that grow businesses and build wealth in businesses and grow the economy, and what share of business revenue comes out as personal income. And the higher the share of business revenue used to run and grow businesses, the stronger the long-term economic growth rate. The larger the share of business revenue that comes out of businesses as personal income to owners, the weaker the long-term economic growth rate. And that's what happened with the 1986 tax reform. More revenue came out of businesses, and it was followed by weaker growth and some other problems like trade deficits and budget deficits and whatnot. So to get that strong economic growth, it helps to have productive tax avoidance. Now, you need the low average tax rate on business owners to reduce unproductive tax avoidance. But when a business owner is looking at taking an additional dollar of revenue as personal income or plowing that additional dollar, that last dollar of business revenue, into growing the business, the marginal tax rate on that decision influences the decision. And the higher the marginal tax rate is, the more attractive building wealth tax-free within a business becomes, or at least tax deferred. If you build wealth in a business, you can defer taxes on it indefinitely. And so you want the low average tax rate on business owners with a high marginal rate. Now, let's look at some data. We'll start with 1984. Typically, the top tax rate one year has its strongest influence on growth 2 years later. So when the top tax rate went to 50% in 1982, it started influencing, had its biggest influence on growth started in 1984. So this chart starts in 1984, and the black line with the black dots shows the GDP growth rate. And on the top of the chart, the green line with the green triangles shows the top marginal tax rate. And the top tax rate was at 50% for 5 years, from 82 to 86. And that data is pushed forward 2 years, so those first 5 triangles correspond with the influence on growth for the years 84 through 88. And those were a strong 5-year period of growth. Then the tax reform, you can see the drop in the green triangles where the top tax rate goes down to 28%, and there is a weakening of economic growth following that tax reform. Now, the blue line at the bottom shows the capital gains tax rate, and that first point on the blue line is when it shows a 28% capital gains rate. And while the top tax rate influences growth about 2 years later, the capital gains rate has its strongest correlation with growth with a 4 or 5 year lead time. This chart shows a 4-year lead time. So that first triangle of 28% is actually the capital gains rate in 1980, and it's showing the influence on growth in 1984. So that now 1984 was the strongest year of growth, per person since 1950. That was a really strong year, and it was influenced by a top rate of 50% and a capital gains rate of 28%. The capital gains rate and the top marginal tax rate both influence growth, and the red line, or the model of those two tax rates, wiggles where either the green line or the blue line wiggle. And in this portion of in this time period, that's a positive correlation. The higher the tax rate, the stronger the growth. The weaker the tax rate, or the lower the tax rate, the weaker the growth tends to be. However, in the bigger, longer term picture, it's more of a Goldilocks relationship. You don't want the tax rate to be too high, and you don't want it to be too low. You want the high enough marginal tax rate that you get that productive tax avoidance, where business owners avoid tax by growing wealth in their businesses, and growing their businesses grows the economy. To get that fuller perspective on the capital gains tax rate, we're going to look at another chart. In this chart, we show the relationship between the capital gains tax rate and the economic growth rate since 1950. And it's a Goldilocks relationship. And the growth optimizing tax rate, and this correlation suggests it's around 27%. But depending on which chart you use and the time period, you can come up with an optimal rate somewhere between about 25% and 32%. This chart suggests it's 27%, and that's a pretty good guess. Now, when Reagan came into office, the growth with the 4-year lead time was influenced by the 39.9% capital gains tax rate. And that influenced the back-to-back recessions of 1980 and the 81-82 recession that started under Reagan. So that was kind of hurting growth when Reagan came into office. Carter cut the capital gains tax rate in 1979 to 28%, and that was in place from 1979 through 1980. And that 28% tax rate influenced Reagan's strongest 2 years of growth in 1983 and 1984. Reagan, his first year in office, he cut the capital gains tax rate to 20%. And that influenced the growth in the years in the red points. And then in his tax reform, when he cut the top tax rate on top marginal tax rate to 28%, he also increased the capital gains rate back to 28%. And it stayed at 28% for 10 years. And that 28% capital gains rate really benefited the growth under President Clinton. Now, in last week's video, I said Reagan probably wasn't responsible for the recession that started in August of 1981. And part of that was this capital gains tax rate that was way too high or it was way above the optimal and harmed growth. The other thing that was going on was inflation. In the 1970s, we had two bouts of double-digit inflation. One peaked in 1975, and the other one peaked in March of 1980. And those two bouts of inflation followed about 3 years after the 1972 election, where Fed Chairman Arthur Burns pumped up growth in the money supply. And about 3 years after the 1976 election, where Arthur Burns again pumped up the money supply. And we'll get more into this when we talk about Carter. But he changed the mandate of the Fed. He gave the Fed a dual mandate where, in addition to maximizing employment and growth, he added stable prices as one of the Fed's mandate. And he appointed Paul Volcker. And Volcker was set on fulfilling that second mandate of stable prices. And one of the things he did was he pushed up interest rates to deter money growth and to fight inflation. Now here's a chart of quarterly GDP and the rate and the interest rate or the yield on 3-month Treasury bills. And Volcker pushed up interest rates until we had a recession in 1980, and then when that recession hit, he backed off on the interest rates. And then not long after that, he was pushing, when the economy was starting to recover, he pushed up the interest rates again to even higher highs. Now those two highs in 1980 and 1981 and 2 were the highest interest rates the United States have had since at least the Civil War. But following that, inflation came down and interest rates came down, and we had strong growth under Reagan. And so the recessions, those two recessions, were partly a part of Volcker and partly a part of bad tax policy where the capital gains rate was too high. What we can learn from the tax changes that Reagan had is that it's important to minimize unproductive tax avoidance with a low average tax rate on business owners, where those first 5 to 10 brackets in the income tax schedule allow business owners a large enough income at a low enough average tax rate that there's incentive to run businesses. And we need to learn that productive tax avoidance, where there is a high enough marginal rate that business owners are better off growing wealth in their businesses tax-free than taking income. And next week we'll continue learning that lesson of finding out what we need to do to restore that long-term prosperity that can fulfill Reagan's vision of an America that is a light to the world. And next week we'll be looking at the tax policy of George W. Bush. Have a great week. Hope we'll see you next time.